Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into uh, a really foundational set of rules, the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols.
Yeah, stuff that really shapes how we understand global conflict. It's surprisingly relevant to a lot of the complex issues we see today.
It really is. And for this, we're relying on a document that you, our listener, actually shared with us. It's titled Basic Rules on the Geneva Conventions and Their Additional Protocols.pdf.
That's our source material for this one, a really helpful breakdown.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to pull out the core principles, the key protections from these fundamental legal texts.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, a way to grasp the basics of international humanitarian law in armed conflict. We'll try to make it clear and hopefully engaging.
Right. Because what's amazing is how these rules, some written decades ago, are still so central, aren't they?
Yeah.
Understanding them can give you that real aha moment when you're watching the news.
Totally. You suddenly see the framework behind the headlines.
Yeah. And the document structures it nicely, starting with common provisions, then wounded and sick, POWs, civilians, and finally non-international conflicts will follow that structure.
Makes sense. Start broad, then get specific.
So let's kick off with those common principles.
What?
What are the big ideas that run through all of these agreements?
Okay, well, the first big one is just applicability. When do these rules actually apply?
Right. It's not just declared wars, is it?
No, not at all. They apply in any armed conflict between signatory countries right from the start, even if the countries involved don't formally recognize that a state of war exists.
Okay, that's broad already.
And it gets broader. Protocol specifically extends this to conflicts against colonial domination, alien occupation, and racist regimes, basically recognizing struggles for self-determination.
Wow, okay. That really reframes certain conflicts legally.
It does. And the protection doesn't just stop when the fighting ends for everyone.
What do you mean?
Well, for certain people think those waiting for release, repatriation, or resettlement, the protections continue until that process is fully complete.
Gotcha. So it covers the aftermath, too.
Exactly. And there's this underlying principle, sort of the safety net, the principle of humanity. Even in situations not explicitly covered, or if a country pulls out, people are still protected by basic international law, custom, human decency, the dictates of public conscience.
So there's a baseline ethical standard, regardless of the specific text.
That's the idea. Which leads nicely into the next point, the prohibition of reprisals.
Ah, retaliation. This seems vital to stop things escalating horribly.
It's absolutely crucial. Reprisals, basically illegal acts taken to stop previous illegal acts by the other side, are strictly forbidden against a whole list of protected people and things.
Like who?
Okay, so the wounded, sick, shipwrecked, medical folks in facilities, civil defense workers, POWs, civilians, cultural property, the environment, and installations containing dangerous forces like dams or nuclear plants.
That's a long list. So no tit for tat against vulnerable groups or essential things.
Pretty much. The document does note, though, that reprisals are only considered permissible in the conduct of hostilities.
Meaning, like directly related to a military operation.
It suggests a very narrow military context, yeah. And definitely not against any of those protected categories we just listed.
Okay. And linked to protection is this idea of non-renunciation of rights. People can't be forced to give up their protections.
Spot on. War victims, protected persons, they can't be pressured into signing away the rights these conventions and protocols give them. They're non-negotiable safeguards.
Makes sense. Who specifically does that cover?
The document lists medical personnel, the wounded, sick, shipwrecked, POWs, civilian internees, people in occupied territories, and foreigners in a conflict zone. They all keep their rights.
Okay, so we have these rights, but who actually checks if they're being followed? How is it supervised? You mentioned protecting powers in the ICRC.
Right. Supervision is key. The conventions encourage parties to accept oversight from protecting powers neutral states looking after each side's interests in enemy territory.
Like diplomatic intermediaries.
Sort of, yeah. And if no protecting powers are appointed, the ICRC steps in to help facilitate that. But the ICRC also has its own distinct humanitarian role.
They can operate independently.
Absolutely. Their work isn't limited by protecting powers. In fact, sometimes governments agree to let the ICRC handle the humanitarian tasks usually done by protecting powers.
And they have special access, don't they?
Crucially, yes. ICRC delegates have the right to visit any place where protected persons are held, POW camps, internment centers, and, importantly, to talk to them privately without witnesses.
Without witnesses. That sounds vital for getting honest accounts.
It's fundamental. They need full access to do their job effectively.
Okay. Now, what about when things go wrong? When the rules are broken, the document talks about sanctions and specifically grave breaches.
Yeah, this is where it gets very serious. There's a difference between, say, minor rule breaks needing disciplinary action and these grave breaches.
Which are essentially.
War crimes, that's what they are under international law. Really serious violation.
Like what? What counts as a grave breach?
Okay, the list is quite sobering. Against protected people or property, it includes things like willful killing, torture, inhuman treatment that includes biological experiments causing great suffering or serious injury, endangering health, unlawful deportation or transfer, illegal detention,
Oh.
forcing someone to serve in enemy forces, denying a fair trial, taking hostages, and massive unjustified destruction of property.
These are clearly acts that society finds abhorrent.
Universally condemned,
Yeah.
yeah. And protocol adds more, particularly focusing on acts causing death or serious injury.
Such as?
Attacks targeting civilians or civilian objects directly. Indiscriminate attacks, ones that can't distinguish or hit military and civilian targets without distinction. Attacking dams, dikes, nuclear plants knowing it'll cause excessive civilian harm. Attacking undefended zones. Attacking someone who's hors de combat out of the fight. Or, perfidious use of the Red Cross or Red Crescent emblem.
Using the emblem deceptively.
Exactly. To trick the enemy. That's a grave breach.
And there are still other categories.
Yes. Things like an occupying power moving its own population into occupied territory, deporting the occupied population, unjustified delays in repatriating POWs or civilians after the fighting stops, apartheid and similar practices, and attacking clearly marked historical monuments, artworks, or places of worship.
So a wide range of very serious offenses. What's the obligation on governments when these happen?
It's quite clear. Governments must enact laws with effective criminal penalties for these breaches. They have to actively search for alleged perpetrators, and that includes prosecuting those whose failure to act led to a breach.
So commanders are responsible too.
Absolutely. Military commanders have a duty to prevent breaches, suppress them if they happen, and report them.
And who prosecutes? Is it just the country involved?
No, and this is crucial, it's universal jurisdiction. Because grave breaches are so serious, any signatory state has the obligation to either prosecute the alleged offender, regardless of nationality or where the crime happened, or extradite them to another state that will.
Universal jurisdiction. That's a powerful concept.
It really is. It highlights the global commitment to accountability, and there's the possibility of international criminal courts, too.
Okay. The last common principle mentioned is dissemination. Spreading the word. Why is that so important?
Because for these rules to work, people need to know them. Military personnel, civilians, everyone.
Makes sense.
So parties to the conflict have a duty to include study of the conventions and protocols in military training. And they need to encourage civilians to learn about them too, in peacetime and wartime. Leaders need to know this stuff inside out.
And commanders need advice.
Yes, they must have access to legal advisors who can guide them on applying these laws and instructing their troops correctly. It's about embedding these rules in practice.
Right, making it part of the operational DNA, almost. Okay, that covers the common principles. Let's move to Chapter 2, protecting the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked. Conventions P and A2 sound similar here.
They are, very much so. Convention I is for land warfare, Convention 2 is for sea. The core principles are basically identical, just adapted for the different environments. Protocol I then broadens the protection explicitly to all wounded, sick, and shipwrecked, whether they're military or civilian.
Okay. And how are those terms wounded, sick, shipwrecked defined?
Pretty straightforwardly. Wounded and sick are military or civilians needing medical care who are refraining from hostile acts. Shipwrecked are those in peril at sea or in other waters due to misfortune, also refraining from hostility.
So their status depends on both their condition and their behavior.
Exactly. And once they fall into that category, they get specific protections.
Which?
Respect and protection in all circumstances. Humane treatment. Prompt medical care as much as possible, without any discrimination, except maybe based on urgent medical needs.
And no discrimination based on which side they're on.
None. And women get special consideration due to their sex. Also, captured combatants who are wounded or sick become POWs, so they get protection under both sets of rules. The rules for the wounded and the rules for POWs.
The document also really stresses searching for the wounded, dead, and missing. That feels incredibly important for families.
It's fundamental. Families have a right to know the fate of their relatives. So parties must take immediate, feasible measures, especially after a battle, to search for and collect the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked.
And protect them.
Yes, protect them from harm or robbery and ensure they get care. There's also a duty to search for the dead and prevent their bodies being despoiled.
Are there rules for handling the dead?
Yes. Burials or cremations should be individual if possible, preceded by a careful examination, ideally medical, to confirm deaths, identify the person, and make a report. And parties must search for those reported missing by the other side, especially once hostilities end.
Which means record keeping must be crucial. What info needs recording?
Everything needed for identification: nationality, service number, name, date of birth, details of capture or treatment. This info has to be sent quickly to the official information bureau set up under Convention III, often via the ICRC's Central Tracing Agency.
It's not just soldiers involved in this, is it? Civilians and relief groups play a role too.
Absolutely. Civilians must respect the wounded and sick and not attack them. Civilians and relief groups like the National Red Cross or Red Crescent societies are authorized to collect and care for them even in occupied areas.
And they can't be punished for doing that.
No, they're protected from harassment or prosecution for these humanitarian acts. Authorities can even appeal for their help. The same applies to neutral ships at sea helping the shipwrecked.
Okay, let's talk medical units and transport. Hospitals, ambulances, they get special protection.
Yes, both fixed units like hospitals and mobile units like ambulances, military or civilian, are protected. They need to belong to or be recognized by a party to the conflict or provided by a neutral state or impartial body.
And they have to be purely medical.
Right. Assigned medical purposes: searching, treating, transporting the wounded sick, disease prevention. That's their sole function.
But that protection isn't absolute?
No, it can be lost if the unit is used for harmful acts like sheltering healthy combatants or acting as a military post, but only after a clear warning with a time limit is ignored.
What about captured medical equipment?
Equipment from captured mobile military units must be kept for treating the wounded. And in occupied territories, civilian medical units and staff can't be requisitioned if they're still needed by the local population. Red Cross property is private property only requisitioned in extreme urgency after patient welfare is secured.
And positioning. Should they be near fighting?
Ideally, no. They should be located away from military objectives if possible for safety.
Makes sense. What about medical transport specifically? Ambulances, hospital ships?
Also protected. Any transport, land, sea, air, used for the wounded, sick, shipwrecked, or medical religious personnel and equipment. Land transport, like ambulances, gets the same protection as mobile units. If captured, the captor takes responsibility for those inside.
And ships. Hospital ships have specific rules.
Yes, very specific. Hospital ships, military, Red Cross, neutral, are protected if their details are notified to all parties. They can't be attacked or captured. Belligerents can board and inspect them, though.
What if they're in a port that gets captured?
They have to be allowed to leave. Other medical ships and craft get the same protection as mobile medical units.
And medical aircraft, flying ambulances.
They're protected in friendly or uncontested airspace. In contact zones, they fly at their own risk unless there's a prior agreement. But even without an agreement, once recognized, they must be respected.
Flying over enemy territory needs permission.
Generally, yes, and they can't be used for military advantage, like spying or searching for wounded without agreement. They might be ordered to land for inspection.
What about flying over neutral countries?
Needs agreement, usually, unless it's an emergency. If they land combatants in neutral territory, the neutral state has to care for them but also detain them to prevent them rejoining the fight.
Okay, what about the medical personnel themselves? Doctors, nurses, chaplains.
They must be respected and protected, military or civilian, if assigned exclusively to medical tasks or administration of medical units transport. Chaplains, too. They're protected personnel.
How are they identified?
Identity cards and the Red Cross Crescent emblem. They can carry light personal weapons for self-defense and defending patients.
What if military medical staff are captured? Are they POWs?
Not technically POWs. They can be retained to care for actual POWs, but while retained, they get at least POW protections. And again, civilian medical staff in occupied areas can't be forced to work if needed locally.
There's also the medical mission concept mentioned.
Yeah. Protocol I says no one can be punished for ethical medical acts, regardless of who benefits, and doctors can't be forced to act against medical ethics. It protects their professional integrity.
Lastly, for this section, the emblem. The Red Cross or Red Crescent, its use is strictly controlled.
Extremely strictly. It's only for protected medical units, transport, and personnel with competent authority consent,
Hmm.
displayed on flags, buildings, vehicles, armlets, size as needed for visibility.
And hospital ships.
Painted white, big red crosses fly the Red Cross flag. Misuse or imitation of the emblem is forbidden, and perfidious use, using it deceptively for military advantage, is a grave breach.
Other signals.
Yes. Distinctive light, radio, or radar signals can also be authorized to identify medical units and transport.
Okay, that clarity is vital. Let's move to Chapter 3. Conduct of combatants and protection of prisoners of war. A big section.
Huge. It covers who qualifies as a combatant and POW, how combatants must behave, and then the detailed rules for protecting POWs.
So starting with status, who is a combatant and who becomes a POW if captured?
The basic rule: any member of a state's armed forces is a combatant. If captured, they become a POW. That's Convention 3rd and Protocol 1, Article 43.
But there are conditions for armed forces to be recognized, right?
Yes. They need to be organized under a responsible command structure linked to a party in the conflict, and crucially, have an internal disciplinary system that enforces the laws of war.
And they have to distinguish themselves from civilians.
That's a key part. Usually via uniform or a distinctive sign, especially during attacks or deployment before an attack. Violating rules can lead to punishment, but if they carry arms openly during the engagement, they should still get POW status if captured.
What if a whole group consistently ignores the rules of distinction?
That's serious. It could potentially lead to all members of that force losing combatant and POW status. It emphasizes the importance of following the rules.
And POW status isn't just for regular soldiers.
No, it extends to others. Participants in a levée en masse, a spontaneous civilian uprising in non-occupied territory if they carry arms openly and follow the laws of war. Also, authorized personnel accompanying forces like war correspondents or contractors, merchant marine and civil aviation crews, military personnel and civil defense.
What about people in occupied territory?
People arrested there belonging to the occupied country's forces, yes. Military internees in neutral countries, too. And non-combatant medical religious personnel get POW treatment, even if not full status.
You mentioned exceptions to the distinction rule earlier, when combatants can't wear uniforms.
In very specific, exceptional operational circumstances. But even then, they must carry arms openly during the engagement itself and during the visible military deployment just before it. Failure means they might lose POW status if captured, though they still get basic protections if prosecuted. But this doesn't change the general rule about uniforms for regular units.
And to avoid confusion on the battlefield, there's a presumption.
Yes. Protocol AL says anyone taking part in hostilities who is captured is presumed to be a POW. They're treated as such unless a tribunal decides otherwise. Even if denied POW status later, they still get protection under Convention 4th, civilians, and the fundamental guarantees in Protocol 1, Article 75.
But some are explicitly excluded. Spies, mercenaries.
Correct. Spies and mercenaries are not entitled to POW status, and a critical point on children. Under 15s cannot be recruited or allowed to take part in hostilities.
Okay, let's shift to the actual conduct of combatants. What are the limits on how they can fight?
The fundamental rule: the right to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited.
Meaning?
You can't use weapons or methods designed to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, or weapons expected to cause widespread, long-term, severe environmental damage. And you can't use civilians to shield military objectives or operations.
And perfidy. We touched on that grave breach earlier.
Yes, killing, injuring, or capturing by perfidy is banned. That's betraying enemy trust after leading them to believe they have protection. Improper use of emblems, white flag, cultural property sign, Red Cross crescent falls under this. Using enemy or neutral uniforms during attacks or to shield operations is also forbidden. It demands a minimum level of honesty.
What about treatment of enemies who are out of the fight?
Absolutely forbidden to declare no quarter, meaning no survivors. Threatening it is also banned. Anyone hors de combat, wounded, sick, surrendered, or parachuting from a distressed aircraft cannot be attacked. If you capture prisoners but can't evacuate them safely, you must release them with safety precautions.
Right. Now let's get into the detailed protection for those who do become POWs. What are their basic rights and duties?
First, they're in the hands of the enemy power, the state, not the individuals who captured them. They're entitled to respect for their person and honor. Women must be treated appropriately for their sex, at least as well as men. They keep their civil capacity, like the right to marry by proxy if their home law allows.
And their obligations.
Primarily military discipline and laws of war. They must give name, rank, date of birth, service number when asked, but no physical or mental torture or coercion to get any other info. They might be released on parole, promising not to fight again. If so, they're bound by that promise. Honesty is key for these rules to work.
And their general treatment throughout captivity.
Humane treatment always. No reprisals against them. Equal treatment generally, though. Rank, sex, health might allow for some privileges. Physical mutilation or non-beneficial medical experiments are banned, except maybe voluntary blood skin donation. No unnecessary exposure to danger. If captured in unusual circumstances preventing evacuation, they must be released safely.
Where can they be held?
Only on land, in places meeting hygiene standards, not in combat zones or used to shield military targets. And remember, even those captured who don't get full POW status still get fundamental guarantees.
What about the physical conditions? Housing, food, health?
The detaining power is responsible for keeping them healthy. Special respect and protection for women and children under 15 against assault. Detailed rules cover adequate quarters, sufficient food and water, clothing, hygiene facilities, and necessary medical attention, preferably by their own nationality's medics.
Can they be transferred to another country?
Only to another convention signatory that is willing and able to apply the rules. Transfers must be humane, no worse than how the detaining power moves its own troops.
And beyond physical needs, what about mental well-being?
Very important. The conventions cover freedom of religion, intellectual, and sports activities. Also, suitable work mainly to maintain well-being and prevent boredom, but with strict rules against exploitation or contributing to the war effort. They have rights regarding personal property, working pay, and correspondence sending receiving letters and cards, usually free postage.
Can they receive aid parcels?
Yes, they have the right to receive individual or collective relief. Standard parcels distributed by prisoners' reps are preferred. Relief shipments are exempt from import duties. This acknowledges the role of the ICRC and national societies.
How is discipline maintained in camps?
Camps are under a responsible commissioned officer of the detaining tower who must know the conventions. Texts must be posted in the prisoner's language. POWs can wear rank badges and decorations. Commanders must prevent and report breaches by their own troops.
What about escapes?
Escapes are seen as consistent with military duty. Punishments are limited. Weapons against escapees are a last resort after warnings.
And prisoners' representatives?
Elected every 6 months by secret ballot, except officers, where it's the senior officer. They liaise with authorities, ICRC, etc., look after prisoner welfare, supervise relief, and handle complaints. Prisoners have an unrestricted right to complain to protecting powers or the ICRC.
What kinds of punishments can POWs face?
They're subject to the detaining powers military laws, but with leniency urged. Disciplinary sanctions are limited, max 30 days, basic rights maintained, no cruelty, and only given by the camp commander, not other POWs. Judicial sanctions require a military court, usually.
Are there limits on penalties?
Yes, no penalty harsher than for the detaining power's own soldiers for the same act. Collective punishment, corporal punishment, torture, dark confinement, all forbidden. Even if convicted, they keep convention protections. The death penalty is possible for capital offenses if the detaining power's own forces could face it, but the court must consider the POW's non-national status and lack of allegiance. Pregnant women, mothers of infants, under 18s ideally shouldn't face it or have it carried out. There's a minimum 6 months delay for executions, allowing protecting power intervention.
And court procedures must be fair.
Absolutely. Essential judicial guarantees apply even if POW status is uncertain. Right to know the charge, presumption of innocence, no forced confessions, public judgment, no double jeopardy, right to defense, lawyer, witnesses, interpreter, right to appeal. These are fundamental.
What happens when the fighting stops? Repatriation.
Yes. Seriously wounded sick should be repatriated directly during hostilities. Less serious cases might go to neutral countries. Mixed medical commissions decide. No one repatriated against their will during hostilities. Repatriated medical cases can't return to active service. After active hostilities cease, all POWs must be released and repatriated without delay.
Any exceptions?
Only those convicted or being prosecuted for criminal offenses, they can be held until the legal process or sentence is finished.
What if a POW dies in captivity?
They have the right to make a will. Burial cremation must be respectful, recorded, and marked. Protocol adds detail. Suspicious deaths require an inquiry. Death certificates go to the Information Bureau.
And these Information Bureau and the Central Tracing Agency are key for tracking people.
Vital. The ICRC's Central Tracing Agency holds vast archives. Governments must set up National Bureau to collect and share info on identity, transfers, releases, deaths, etc. Free postage helps. Families have a right to know. Parties must search for the missing.
Relief societies and the ICRC seem crucial throughout.
Their role is explicitly recognized. Detaining powers must grant them facilities to visit prisoners, distribute relief, religious, educational, recreational aid, and help organize leisure. The ICRC's special status is respected.
And visits by protecting powers in the ICRC are a formal right.
Yes. Representatives can go anywhere POWs are held, camps, work sites, prisons, access all premises. ICRC delegates have the same rights, though appointment needs detaining power approval. Parties must give the ICRC all feasible facilities for its humanitarian work. National Red Cross Crescent Societies, too.
Okay, that's a very thorough look at POWs. Let's move to Chapter 4. Protection of civilians and populations in wartime. You mentioned earlier this was less covered by the original conventions, but significantly expanded by Protocol 1.
That's right. General protection against the effects of hostilities wasn't the main focus of the 1949 conventions. That was more the domain of the older Hague Conventions, which are largely customary law now. But modern warfare, especially aerial bombing, necessitated clearer rules, which is what Part 4 of Protocol I provides.
So what's a fundamental principle here?
Same starting point as for combatants. The right to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited. From that flow, two basic rules for civilians.
Which are?
1. Prohibition of weapons methods causing unnecessary injury. 2. The absolute obligation to distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian property and military objectives. Operations must only be directed against military objectives.
How is civilian defined? And civilian property?
Anyone not in the armed forces is a civilian. If in doubt, assume civilian. The civilian population is all civilians. Civilian property is anything that's not a military objective.
And a military objective is?
Something which, by its nature, location, purpose, or use, effectively contributes to military action, and whose destruction or capture offers a definite military advantage at that time. Examples: military gear, a strategic bridge, a supply convoy, a civilian house being used as a command post. If unsure about a normally civilian object, assume it's civilian. Don't attack it.
So what protection do civilians and their property get?
Prohibition of all violence against them, offensive or defensive. No attacks or threats aimed at terrorizing civilians. Indiscriminate attacks are banned.
What counts as indiscriminate?
Attacks not aimed at a specific military target, or using weapons that can't be aimed accurately enough. Treating several distinct military targets in a civilian area as one big target, or attacks causing excessive incidental civilian harm compared to the expected military gain.
Proportionality rule.
Exactly. Also, you can't use civilian presence to shield military targets or operations. The Fourth Convention does allow local agreements for evacuating vulnerable groups from besieged areas and letting aid pass through.
Protocol adds rules about survival needs.
Yes, crucially, it forbids starving civilians as a method of warfare. You can't attack or destroy things essential for survival. Food supplies, farms, livestock, drinking water installations, irrigation systems. The only exception is on your own territory, out of absolute military necessity. And the environment must be protected from widespread, long-term, severe damage.
Some property gets special protection too. Cultural sites, dangerous installations.
Right. Cultural property, historic monuments, art, places of worship must not be attacked or used for military purposes. Dams, dikes, nuclear power plants, things containing dangerous forces also must not be attacked, even if they're military objectives, because the potential civilian harm is too great. Unless they're being used for regular, significant, direct military support, and attacking is the only feasible way to stop that support. They can be marked with 3 bright orange circles.
There are also special zones mentioned.
Yeah.
Safety zones, neutralized zones. What are they?
Safety zones under Convention 4 can be set up to shelter the wounded, sick, elderly, children, expectant mothers. Protecting powers ICRC help establish them. Neutralized zones, Protocol 1, are agreed upon in fighting areas to shelter non-participants temporarily.
And non-defended localities, demilitarized zones.
A non-defended locality is basically an open town near the front line, declared undefended if all military presence and activity is removed, can't be attacked. A demilitarized zone is similar, an area agreed by both sides to be kept free of military operations.
To prevent civilian harm, attackers have to take precautions.
Yes, significant ones. Planners must do everything feasible to verify targets are military. Choose methods to minimize incidental civilian harm. Refrain from attacks expected to cause excessive civilian harm, that proportionality test again. Give advance warning to civilians if possible, and defenders should avoid placing military objectives near civilians and take precautions like building shelters.
What about civil defense workers, first responders, rescue teams?
They perform vital humanitarian tasks. Warning, evacuation, shelters, rescue, medical aid, firefighting, essential services. They and their organizations must be respected and protected while doing these jobs unless there's imperative military necessity. Their equipment is also protected.
Does this apply in occupied territory too?
Yes. The occupying power can't requisition their buildings or equipment if still needed. Protection is lost only if they commit harmful acts outside their tasks after a warning is ignored. Being organized militarily, carrying light weapons for order self-defense, or incidentally helping military victims doesn't count as harmful.
If a special sign.
Yes, a blue equilateral triangle on an orange background. Military personnel assigned exclusively to civil defense are also protected if they meet the conditions and display the sign. If captured, they become POWs.
Okay, we've covered international conflicts. Chapter V deals with non-international armed conflicts, internal conflicts. This is crucial given how many conflicts today are internal.
Absolutely. The rules here apply in two main scenarios. First, clear hostilities within a state between government forces and organized armed groups. Second, more intense conflicts where dissident forces control territory and can conduct sustained military operations.
The baseline for all internal conflicts is Common Article 3, found in all 4 conventions.
Exactly. It's often called a mini-convention. It applies in any non-international armed conflict. It demands humane treatment for everyone not actively participating in the hostilities, including surrendered or wounded fighters, without any adverse distinction.
What does it specifically prohibit?
At all times, everywhere. Violence to life person, murder, mutilation, cruel treatment, torture, hostage-taking, outrages upon personal dignity, humiliating, degrading treatment, and executions without judgment by a regularly constituted court with essential judicial guarantees.
So minimum standards even in internal wars?
Minimum standards, yes, and it explicitly states the ICRC can offer its services and encourages parties to agree to apply other convention provisions. Applying Common Article 3 doesn't change the legal status of the parties involved.
For the more intense internal conflicts, Additional Protocol 2 adds more detail.
Yes. If the fighting reaches that higher threshold, sustained operations, territorial control, Protocol 2 applies in addition to Common Article 3.
And it mirrors some protections from international conflicts, like for the wounded and sick.
It does. Respect, protection, humane treatment, medical care without discrimination, except medical grounds, duty to search for wounded dead, protection for medical personnel, can't be punished for ethical acts, can't be forced to violate ethics, protection for medical units transport unless used for hostile acts, respect for the red cross crescent emblem.
What about protecting civilians in Protocol 2?
This is a major focus, extends key protections from Protocol 1. Civilians cannot be attacked. Terrorism against civilians is banned. Protection lasts unless they directly participate in hostilities. Starvation as a method of war is prohibited. Forced displacement only for civilian safety or imperative military reasons, with proper reception conditions ensured. Relief actions by groups like the Red Cross are permitted with consent.
And protection for certain objects.
Yes, special protection for objects vital for civilian survival. Food, water sources, cultural property places of worship not to be attacked or used militarily, and installations containing dangerous forces, dams, nuclear plants.
Protocol 2 also details humane treatment generally.
Yes, reinforcing Common Article 3. All non-participants treated humanely, fundamental guarantees respected without discrimination. Respect for person, honor, convictions, religion. Lists prohibited acts again. Violence to life, health, murder, torture, mutilation, indignity, humiliation, rape, enforced prostitution, hostages, collective punishments, threats.
Specific rules for children and detained persons.
Yes. Children get needed care aid, including education, steps taken to reunite families, under 15s not recruited or allowed to participate, evacuation from hostilities only with consent for safety. Those detained interned for conflict reasons get guarantees on medical care, food, hygiene, safety, relief, religion, working conditions. Men, women separated, unless families. Male allowed. Internment away from combat zones, physical, mental health protected.
And judicial guarantees for detainees.
Crucial. Sentences only by independent, impartial courts. Right to no charges, presumption of innocence, no collective responsibility, no retroactive offenses, judgment in presence of accused, no forced confessions, right to appeal information, death penalty not for under 18s at time of offense, or pregnant women mothers of dependent infants. These guarantees apply fully until liberty is restored.
Wow. It's an incredibly detailed framework covering so many aspects of conflict. We've gone through the whole document you provided. Bring it all together. What's the absolute key takeaway here?
I think the core message is that even in the midst of something as destructive as war, there's this vital body of law, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, that establishes fundamental protections. It emphasizes humane treatment for everyone affected and puts real limits on how war can be fought. It's about preserving a measure of humanity.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, based on your document, really gives that foundational grasp of these essential rules. What really strikes me is the sheer detail, especially around things like POW rights or the specific prohibitions. It shows a serious attempt to regulate the chaos.
It does. It's complex, but the intent is clear. And for you, our listeners, if this has sparked your interest, there's so much more to explore. Specific areas like targeting rules, new weapons technology, the challenges of enforcement.
Where would you suggest people look?
Well, the ICRC website is an amazing resource. There's a wealth of information there for anyone wanting to dig deeper into international humanitarian law.
Great suggestion. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given how complex modern conflicts are, different actors, cyber warfare, asymmetric fighting, what do you think are the biggest challenges we face today in actually upholding these vital principles in practice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Definitely something to think about.
It certainly is. Thank you so much for walking us through this. It's been incredibly insightful, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive.